Good morning. I'm Jim Check. You're watching Kelowna Now. I have with me on the phone Ian Burns. At some point this week, we're going to have his face on here. But the really big story today, and I mean the really big story, is obviously Donald Trump's inauguration. And we lead off with that. And the Toronto Sun had a big photo out there. A new dawn. I guess play on words there. A new dawn. Donald Trump right at this moment just did his. They swore him in, so his speech is upcoming in a few minutes there. Ian and I are watching that. Any thoughts on that so far, Ian? Do we have Ian there?
Yeah, Ian's here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
All right. Yeah. Well, there's lots to say about it, isn't there? Really, we were talking earlier, weren't we, about how the American version of pomp and circumstance is quite unique and a bit weird. It's not quite on the level of the French or the British, but it's still very interesting. And a lot of it's about relationships, isn't it? A lot of it's about like who gets a handshake and who grimaces in the background, kind of thing. And that's what a lot of people have been looking at. And also like the hierarchy of proximity, how close you are to Donald Trump. Like, for example, Jeff Bezos and all the billionaires who are very close to him. But no, I mean, he's now, I'm looking at it now, he's just about to start his speech. So I think that's the meaty part, to find out what he's actually going to say, what he's going to promise to do.
Yeah, the details are emerging on the executive orders that he plans to sign, because he's supposedly signing 200 executive orders this morning. Or not this morning, it's noon there, just after noon. You can change that slide there, Rommel. Any word on what they're to expect out of those? Well, they're saying 100, but I've heard that it's over 200 executive orders.
Well, I think the big one, and I suppose you have to say, sort of to his credit, if this is indeed what he does, because it's what he promised to do throughout the entire campaign. The big one is supposed to be declaring an emergency at the border, and everything that he promised to do with the border. Apparently, that's what most of these executive orders are going to concern that, and that means finishing off the wall that he didn't really build very much of in his first presidency, declaring the cartels, the drug dealers in Mexico and Central America to be terrorist organizations, changing the process for asylum seekers so that they don't remain in the US, but they remain in Mexico while their application is processed, and everything associated with that. And I think the declaration of emergency is a big one, because they've been asking for that for a very long time. So that I think is going to be rather consequential, and that allows him to access certain funds that he can then use to go and do as he wishes.
That's one of his big promises for sure, was to close the border, and they say they're going to close the border effectively today and using those emergency powers. The other one was he was going to end the war in Israel. There is a ceasefire in place as of yesterday, I guess.
Which is obviously, we should say, is claimed by, that as a victory, a diplomatic victory that is claimed by Joe Biden as well as Donald Trump. So that's going to be a controversial one.
Well,
but he also even promised to end the war in Ukraine, and
that's
as of right now, I believe they're still killing each other in Ukraine.
Yeah. That is the one he said it would end before he took presidency. So the clock is ticking on that one. Biden's own people, though, said that Donald Trump played a big role in the ceasefire, and so did a lot of people in the Arab nations say the same thing. So,
yeah, I mean, you'd have to be ignorant not only of American politics and the American political system, but also ignorant of human nature to think that Trump wasn't important in this, because as soon as he won that election, he was the man that people gravitated to. He was the man with the power. So naturally, his input was significant here.
I think the important thing is, though, that there is a ceasefire. Some hostages have been returned already, 3, I think, and then there's a plan to release more hostages on both sides, prisoners and hostages. So hopefully,
yeah. Well, they're not hostages they aren't hostages. Israel doesn't have hostages.
Prisoners.
Yeah, Israel has mass murderers, terrorists, and various other slime who have been imprisoned over the years by Israel, and that's what Hamas has demanded in exchange for, babies and women, and so on.
Let's turn our attention to. We'll do more on Trump later. Maybe we'll do another show today. Let's turn our attention to our own nation. And the judge has agreed to expedite legal challenge of Trudeau's move to prorogue Parliament. And that decision came down on a Saturday, unusual. So that hearing is supposed to take place February 13th and 14th. So that'll be interesting if that actually plays out. I mean, I'm not too hopeful that that'll force their hand, but I think our nation sits right now kind of rudderless, and we need leadership facing these impending Trump tariffs. And I can't see it any other way than very selfish of the Liberals to put themselves before the candidate itself.
Yeah, well, it could be a very interesting Valentine's Day this year, couldn't it? If that prorogation is ruled to be illegitimate or whatever the judge might say. But yeah, I mean, it's a shocking thing to have done, isn't it? I mean, I know we're living through it, and it's very hard to understand the importance of a moment while you're actually in it. But I think, this is a big deal, and it's quite appalling, actually, isn't it? In the true sense of that word, that
I've tried.
Canada does not have any sort of system in place to really be governed. The country cannot be governed at like this crisis moment.
I've tried really hard to see the other side and had discussions with some people that are defending it. And I just can't see it as anything other than being selfish. And, like the argument from, like some people that are diehard liberals is that, well, the Liberal Party needs some time to put its house in order. I mean, they've had 9 years to put their house in order. And right now, at one of our biggest crises and one of our darkest moments in economic history, we are basically without a strength of leadership and a mandate.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only argument I haven't even heard this argument being made myself, but I've made this argument like in an attempt to understand from both sides, and I think the strongest argument is that it's fundamentally important for the strength of Canadian democracy that there is a proper opposition, let's say. And so if we're going to assume that Pierre Poilievre is going to win, as the polls suggest, it's crucial that there's a proper opposition. And if if there are two main parties in Canada, Liberals and the Conservatives, it's crucial that they are both functioning and they both have reasonably strong candidates. Otherwise, there could be an imbalance in power. That's pretty much the only argument that I can conceive of that makes any sense.
My counter to that would be, though, they've had like a long time, like they've been suffering in the polls for a long time. They've had the ability to do this for a long period of time. Like the pressure for Justin Trudeau to resign has been around for like almost a year.
Yeah, and everything will go back to him ultimately, and that is as it should be, since he's the sort of the leader. He's the big man of the nation. So it is going to be laid at his doorstep. But the Liberals, they also maybe are going to have to take some blame because they've had the opportunity now, as you say, to have removed them for a very long time. It's not all about him just to resign. It's also about the caucus to put pressure on him to resign. And the truth is, it wasn't really there till very recently.
Boris Johnson felt that pressure in England when they just all started resigning, and he finally just resigned.
Yeah, and that happened to Boris. Before Boris, that happened to Theresa May, who he toppled her. Then it also happened to Liz Truss, who succeeded Boris Johnson. So, in Britain, or at least the Conservative Party, once they realise that their candidate is a dud, or that they're finished, or not their candidate necessarily, sorry, their leader, once they realise they're done, they really get rid of them quite quickly. And as I said to you before, that also happened to Margaret Thatcher, who, unlike any of these people we've just mentioned, who are just minnows and losers and pointless people, Margaret Thatcher was a major figure, like a historical figure. And they still got rid of her very rapidly. They got rid of her very quickly. But the Liberals, it's a different organisation, isn't it? I guess they do things differently.
So, former Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland officially launched her campaign for the Liberal Party leadership on Sunday in a speech that was interrupted many times by protesters, and it was I almost felt embarrassed for her. I thought, like she was trying to rely. The speech came across as a little bit awkward, right? I'm a fighter. It seems to be the same lines that Justin Trudeau has been, talking about being a fighter. And also Karina Gold announced her Liberal Party leadership bid.
Yeah, I think she's, she can't really she can't be expecting to win, I don't think, Gould. I think with her, I feel like it's more one of those candidacies similar in America to like Vivek Ramaswamy and some other
Yeah.
people where they kind of run just, they're not really running for the job. They're running for they're not running to be prime minister. They're running for a big job in the future, kind of thing. They're just trying to
Raise their
increase their
profile. Yeah, raise their profile, get it out there. I think last time I looked, Chrystia Freeland had like 39 MPs backing her, and I think Carney had under 20. But a bunch have come out recently, even this morning, supporting Mark Carney. He did his announcement in Edmonton. And Melanie Jolie, one of the more high-profile cabinet ministers, came out in support of Mark Carney. And a lot of Trudeau's inner circle are backing Carney as well. And his big chance to be this feminist. And again, he doesn't take that opportunity.
Yeah, he had two other choices that he could have made, two women. But yeah, I mean, Freeland, my sort of political instincts, for whatever they're worth to anyone, I would say that she is not going to be the leader. I don't think she has the gravitas. I don't think she has the charisma. I don't think she has the record. Whereas Carney, lots of people would say he doesn't, but I think of the field of candidates, I really think Carney is the strongest one, and I do think he's going to win.
You can see the money lining up behind him. You can also see the media, our legacy media, the national outlets, lining up more so behind Carney than they are lining up between. I think that it's a two-horse race, though. It's Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney. Karina Gold, like you said, is more in it for some profile, and it's these two. Chrystia Freeland, I would think, though, she would have had more MPs in her court, but we shall see, right? But it seems like, like the people that, helped Justin Trudeau get where he is seem to be lining up behind Carney as well.
Yeah, which, outside of the party isn't going to do Carney any favors, I don't think, because, I think one of the reasons that Freeland will fail is because she's so strongly connected to Justin Trudeau, and it's really almost impossible, although I'm sure she's going to attempt to do it, but it's almost impossible for her to distance herself from Trudeau and from, his biggest policies over the last 10 years. Whereas Carney can kind of plausibly say, like, look, I was working for the UN, actually, or I was working for the Bank of England. I wasn't even involved in this.
I would argue with you there and say that their main pillar for the past, number of years has been the carbon tax. And Carney, I would say, is an architect of the carbon tax and has been making a living off of it, even when he was working for Brookfield Asset Management, just stepped down as chair there. But I mean, if you look at I posted on LinkedIn, like that organization itself had been exaggerating the amount of carbon credits it has. So it's a lot of stuff that just doesn't make sense. And again, the carbon tax, they've been asked about the carbon tax, almost all three of them, and whether they would remove it, and they all seem to like hum and haw. And basically what you're going to get is a repackaging of the carbon tax. So I don't know if Canadians are palatable for that.
I would say as well with Mark Carney, something else that's going to weigh him down. There's the obvious thing, which is that he's very much an internationalist, and his career tells you that, but his pronouncements also tell you that he is very much he's not a nationalist, put it that way. Whereas it feels like in the West, nationalism is coming back in fashion, so he might lose out for that reason. But also, what's really going to condemn him, I feel, is that he's on the record opposing expansions of pipelines and other sort of natural resources infrastructure in Canada. And it seems like, we'll see what happens with Trump, but it seems like we're going to come in Canada to really, really bitterly rue the fact that we didn't expand pipelines and so on if we become completely, if we get tariffed as it looks like we might, then Carney's going to be in quite an undefensible position because he's going to have this record of having in effect argued against Canadian independence. Really, that's what it's going to look like, and that's going to, I think that will bring him down in the long run.
Aritzia, Canadian Tire, Lululemon among Canadian retailers shifting production outside of China, and likely just going to go in a different nation and the Far East. But they're looking to get ahead of any kind of like tariffs that may be coming for Chinese products. Although, you know, like in the inauguration, the vice president, the first time ever, is on the stage there with Donald Trump of China.
Right, yeah. Well, he likes to keep his enemies close, perhaps, is what you could say to
that. And this one is you and I talked a little bit before we went on. This one is kind of unprecedented for sure. U.S. President Joe Biden issues preemptive pardons before Donald Trump takes office for Anthony Fauci and any officers who testified in the Capitol. But that list got longer just prior to the inauguration ceremony, and then he added to that list. He added his whole family, basically. You know,
lots of members.
Donald Trump had labeled as the the Biden crime family, but there's a long list and again, it's a similar type of pardon that his son Hunter Biden got. This this 10-year period that just like you're protected from any federal crime you may have committed in a 10-year period.
Yeah, I mean it really, really, really does not look good for starters. Just if you accept, you look at it just on the face of it, it doesn't look good. It looks absolutely appalling, doesn't it? It looks so rotten and horrible. And you can only imagine what the reaction would have been if Trump had done that, preemptively pardoned, which is, and it has to be emphasized. Most people, probably for the better, most people don't know about American history and American politics. But this is very, very rare, the preemptive pardon. And we were talking about Gerald Ford, who did that for Nixon after the Watergate scandal. And that in itself, that pardon was almost considered to be as big a scandal as the Watergate scandal itself. And yet, here we are. I mean, that it's so rare as well. I mean, that's one of like a few occasions when it's actually been done, the preemptive pardon. So it's already like a pretty crazy thing to do. But then what he's done here, like in the dying seconds of his presidency, like the clock was literally showing like minutes left of his presidency, and he's preemptively pardoned his own family. I mean, Biden, corruption and black marks and whatnot have followed Biden throughout his whole career, if anybody cares to actually read about his past. But this is like the coup de grace, isn't it? This is just extraordinary levels of corruption. And, I look forward to hearing people express that outrage on both sides of the American political divide.
Danielle Smith had traveled there, and she didn't get to be in the room because she didn't make the list. There's a lot. I mean, they moved it indoors. You can take that one off. Ron, we'll move on to the next one. Yeah, she didn't make the list because they did substantially decrease the amount of people that were allowed in the room when they moved it from outside to inside. And a lot of speculation that it was mainly for security, because you were saying this morning that the temperature is actually only, -5 there, and they've done it in worse.
Well, no, I mean, I don't know if they have done it in worse. I would assume they have, though, because Washington does get quite cold. But when I said that earlier, it was just kind of, from a Canadian perspective anyway, how funny is that they deem -5 to be like a danger to your health or something like that? And even like, I'm just like looking back to when Justin Trudeau used to do his little COVID speeches where he would come out all the time and announce some new liberty that was being removed from the Canadian people. He used to do that outside of his house, and it would be like -20 or something, and he would go out in just like a jacket. And it's kind of like, it's just, I just find that interesting, the contrast between American and Canadian attitudes to the weather, really.
And Danielle Smith being painted as the villain by many in the media and many on the Liberal Party for sure, and even the BC NDP as a, um, not towing the line for Canada. But I just want to remind people on a couple of things. Danielle Smith ran her election as Alberta First, and that was how she got elected. So she's putting Alberta first. Donald Trump ran his election, was voted for on an America First platform. That was his. I mean, that's what the American people voted for. And now, can you say that the Liberal Party puts Canada first? Do we not need a leader that puts Canada first? And can you tell me right now if the Liberal Party puts Canada first?
Well, I think we're going to find out, aren't we? We're going to find out the answer to that question because the Canadian people are going to make that decision quite soon. And I
But I'm just saying,
imagine,
like in our history, like the last 9 years, do you think Canada's been put first in many of these discussions? We talk about pipelines. We put ourselves in this position. Like instead of developing outside markets, we're so heavily reliant on the United States of America. When we had the opportunity when they were begging for our oil and gas in Europe, and we wouldn't sell it to them, we had the opportunity. Quebec had the opportunity for that pipeline to go to the east, and pipelines to the west, and all those things. And we are so heavily reliant on the Americans. And now we're blaming. It's like, when you blame your boss, you blame somebody else for your current situation, when you have to accept responsibility for what's going on. And we have to accept responsibility. For 9 years we did not put Canada first. Our natural resources, our number one asset that we have in the world, has not been put first. It has been put at the altar of the world, or whatever, like different things we sacrificed for Stephen Jabot and Justin Trudeau to stand on a world stage and call out people. He's done that so many times.
yeah, I think another way to express what you're saying there, that maybe is more palatable to certain people, would be to say that the Liberal Party under Trudeau has made a virtue, almost the premier virtue of all virtues, out of internationalism, and looking at Canada as just one country among many on planet Earth, kind of thing. I think that's probably like how
Yeah. Well, he said it himself.
how they would refer to it. But the result of that is, as you say, it's meant things like saying no to. When we say natural resources, let's rephrase it. It means saying no to wealth, basically. So they've turned
Prosperity.
down Canadian wealth because they've looked at the chart of carbon emissions and increasing world temperatures and said, we have to do our part. So we have to say no to this wealth because we need to bring the temperature down, bring the emissions down. Whereas, sadly, the rest of the world, or much of the rest of the world, doesn't care even slightly about that, and in fact actually laughs in the face of Canada when it does that. And Canada is, I mean, it's hard to emphasize just how irrelevant Canada is when it comes to global emissions. It's a rounding error. It's completely unimportant. India, China, and the US are the people that matter. So in that context, yeah, I mean, those are the two arguments put face to face there, and we're going to have to, the Canadian people are going to have to vote on that. This is what the election is going to be about, I think, to some extent.
We've increased the tax burden on the individual instead of tapping our natural resources like Norway, where they have this massive sovereign wealth fund from their oil and gas that the citizens benefit from. Instead, we basically suppress our natural resources and then go after the individual citizen. And then they always look for a scapegoat. They look for a scapegoat in so many different things. We can go back to COVID. We can go back to so many different things. They've always found a scapegoat, and this time it's Danielle Smith that's a scapegoat. And again, she ran to be the leader of Alberta by saying Alberta first. And same as Donald Trump ran with a mandate to put America first. And they're doing their job. We don't have that same thing here in Canada. We do not have a government that puts Canada first. And that is evidenced by where we're at right now, the predicament we find ourselves in.
I would note that I don't think you can really do a like-for-like comparison between Smith and Trump, because Danielle Smith is a Canadian as well as an Albertan, whereas Trump really is just an American. He's not a governor who's putting that state first. And that's the context of the critique of Danielle Smith, I would say. But
Yeah,
she
but I
is
mean,
certainly being pointed at as like she's the cause of this kind of thing, whereas that's obviously not true.
they've been fighting with the federal government for how long with the suppression of Alberta's natural riches that benefit all Canadians. That has been a battle that's been going on since she's been in office, too.
Yeah, and before that, yeah, it goes back decades, doesn't it?
Yeah. And then Mark Carney, there's a tweet that was put out by, and you talked about this too, by Brian Lilly, that a lot of the media outside of Canada does not portray Mark Carney as very favorable for running Canada.
Yeah, well, I would say the Americans haven't got a clue who Mark Carney is, and nor do they care. And that's also true, I think, for a lot of the world. But the only other country in the world that knows who Mark Carney is and cares even slightly about what he's done or what he says is Britain. And yeah, like I've been saying for a while now, his reputation in Britain is probably more on the negative side than the positive. I think he's looked upon as a mediocre governor who didn't. Some people say absolutely catastrophically bad. Other people say kind of all right, he did okay, but in general, not. He's not really deemed to have been the superstar central banker that he was advertised as being when he was recruited in 2013, I believe it was. But also, he's, as you see here in these headlines that you've assembled here, he's looked upon as somebody that butted into the Brexit debate in a way that you're really not supposed to do. I mean, you're not supposed to do that when you're the governor of the Bank of England. You're supposed to be apolitical. You're not supposed to choose a team. And it's also, I mean, it is quite interesting to see in England anyway the response. It's been overwhelmingly negative, I think, so far since he announced his intention to lead the Liberal Party. But yeah, it's interesting, really, isn't it? It's very interesting how you can have a completely different reputation in two different countries. But Carney's reputation, I would say, anyway, as the last word is, it's a lot higher here. It's a lot higher in Canada than it is in England.
Yeah, the Net Zero Alliance that he chaired, has basically they've closed it down. It's fallen apart. All the big U.S. banks have left, and then now the Canadian banks are following. I think 3 Canadian banks, including the TD Bank, have left the Net Zero Alliance, and that just shows you where that is. And then he was also the chair of Brookfield Asset Management. That there's reports out there that say that they've exaggerated their claims on the carbon tax credits. So it's good. It's well worth your time to read some of that information on the climate thing, because that is how he's basically been making his money. He's a big fan of Greta Thunberg, and how this thing is all collapsing around him.
Yeah, and in a way, if you look at it completely neutrally and just on a human level, almost got to feel a little bit sorry for him, because it's like they've been playing pass the parcel and he's ended up holding the bag. It's like everybody's ditched it, and now he's like, okay, now I get to be prime minister. And this, unfortunately for him, is the moment where the net zero malarkey is basically, democratic or electoral poison, and now he's just left holding the bag. It's pitiable in a way.
With Holly Doan and Blacklocks, we have struck an agreement there where we can talk about some of her stories, and they do some great work at Blacklocks. In this one that they put out, it looks like the CBC is looking for more money for ads they can't sell, and the Heritage Minister is likely going to provide that extra money. CBC gets more money, we get zero.
Yeah, well, let's see how long that lasts as well, because as with most conversations, most topics in Canadian politics now, the answer is almost always the same thing, isn't it? Let's see what happens after the election, because Pierre Poilievre, if he wins, has threatened to, quite seriously defund the CBC, particularly the
He's
English
not threatening
language.
to close it. Let's be clear there. He's not threatening to close it. He's just threatening not to support it, like they support themselves. Like right now, dipping into our pockets again for ads they can't sell. There's stuff we can't sell because we don't have our Facebook and Instagram, and people are saying to us, like the clients that have been with us for 10 years that they'll come back and advertise us once we get our Facebook and Instagram back, and we can't reach out to um, the heritage minister and ask if they can make up that shortfall.
Yeah, indeed. Well, yeah, we'll have to wait and see. Yeah, but I mean, it's also to note, Polyev has said that he is going to continue to fund the French language bit of CBC, which that's going to be quite controversial, I think.
And then the National Post put out an opinion piece here saying we're a nation left leaderless. You and I have talked about this already. And this is, I think, again, one of the most selfish moves by the Liberals. And I think, as a Liberal MP, you should stand up and demand an election as well. Because, I mean, if you talk about right now, they're all talking about how they can hear the Canadian voices. They can hear that, people complaining about the carbon tax now. It's amazing that they can hear now that they need a vote. They should be able to hear that Canadians want an election as well.
Yeah, and the premiers, you'd think, because they issue a lot of statements, don't they? They all kind of get together and meet quite frequently. You'd think that they would issue a statement of that kind, even like a spineless political style statement where they make some sort of oblique remark about needing an election or needing clarity or something like that. You'd think that they would do that because as the calendar moves on, and we, especially today of all days, it's becoming more and more obvious how desperate this country is for a government, because in effect it doesn't really have one at the minute. It certainly doesn't have that leadership and the guidance from the top.
Well, nobody in the world theater is going to listen to Justin Trudeau at this moment. He's already resigned. So why would you, right? Why would you negotiate? And the same thing that was happening with Joe Biden for the past couple of months. Nobody was talking to him. They were talking to Donald Trump.
Yeah. And then to have a leadership election at this time of all times, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? It's very, very, very difficult to make the argument, because this is, as many people have said, it's about as serious as it gets. Like, big countries don't go to war with each other anymore. I mean, that's been the case since the end of the Second World War. They don't send tanks into each other's territory anymore. The big ones, I mean, obviously a big one and a little one might get into a scrap like that, but the big countries don't really do that anymore. And yet, here we are, basically at war, because economic war is the only thing that you can really get away with now. So
Yeah,
that's what China and the US are engaged in an economic war, have been for decades.
Yeah.
And this is like warfare. And right on the eve of the start of the war, like right in our sort of like 1939 moment, the Liberal Party is having a leadership election. It's
selfish.
It's very, very hard to wrap your head around.
It's very selfish. Holly Doan, another piece come out, Blacklock's there. It says, and this is a criticism of our government for a long time, and the way we look after our military. The department is failing to maintain critical stockpiles of emergency medical supplies to protect Canadian forces in case of chemical, biological, and nuclear attack. We don't take care of our military. It is an afterthought. We don't spend what we're supposed to spend for NATO. And, we make promises and do these kind of things. But like Donald Trump has made threats to that too, like pay your fair share. You are under the umbrella of the United States, so pay your fair share. Yeah,
well, Trump said that, Canada basically doesn't have a military. I think that's how he phrased it. But I mean, that's dreadful if you think about chemical, biological, and nuclear. So we were just talking there about how big countries don't go to war with each other. That's true. That's been true since the Second World War. Might not stay true forever. And if there was to be a war between big countries, like Western countries and China, let's say, almost certainly it would be those three things, wouldn't it? Nuclear, biological, and chemical. And then that's what we're not prepared for. But I don't know if this is quite as crazy as that other story a few months ago where it was revealed that the Canadian military had acquired lots of outdoor clothing that was only good for like -10 or 5 or something like that. And it's supposed to
there was
work in the
better
Arctic.
stuff from Canadian Tire than there was from what they were being supplied. That's what I mean. Like our military is an afterthought. Even if it is an afterthought, it is shameful how we treat these people that serve our country.
But that's all part of this idea that Canada, that sort of perspective of Canada as inhabiting a post-Cold War universe where everybody's friendly and any disputes will be resolved at the UN and all the rest of it. Like that was a vision of the world once, wasn't it, in the 90s and the last couple of decades? But it doesn't work now. That's the thing.
it contradicts, when Justin Trudeau stands up there and and is screaming about how we need to fund Ukraine for a war, and yet we don't fund our own military.
Yeah, and this same conversation is going on in other NATO countries and like European countries. This debate is going on in Germany, for example, and obviously Britain. I mean, Britain, their military is completely hollowed out. They have, I think they've got something like 70,000 soldiers or something, like a really embarrassingly small amount of soldiers, and yet they're giving tens of billions of pounds in their case to Ukraine, because I mean the truth is they would rather somebody else did it because they don't want to build a military. They don't understand militaries. They don't really like militaries. I think a lot of the elite across the Western world. So they would rather just give money to someone and hope that the problem goes away rather than have to actually
Is
build their own military.
Does that center around Justin Trudeau's statements about Canada is a post-nationalist state too? Does that part play into that?
Absolutely, I would say 100%. Yeah, because I mean, how can a post-nationalist entity, whatever you want to call it, wouldn't really be a country, would it? How could that possibly summon the the will to go out and kill people in the name of the flag and die for the flag? How could you possibly do that if it's a post-national state? It's like, what are you going to kill for? What are you going to die for? For like Tim Hortons or something, or like what's it going to be? What's your like what motivates you? So I think that's really crucial. It's very important.
And they just did that study that Canadians have lost pride in Canada. I mean, you have the leader that has said that Canada is a post-national state, and then you ask yourself why.
Yeah, indeed. And I think a lot of the sort of like intellectual discussion around this subject is that this is what people refer to as the unipolar moment. That's something that you hear that term used quite a lot. It's like after the Cold War, the West, particularly America, had just vanquished all of its enemies and it stood triumphant and unopposed. And that period lasted up until about now, or five or so years ago, when China, and obviously Russia as well, but mainly China, became this like other pole. This we've returned to a world in which there's another superpower with a very, very different view of the world and economics and everything else. And now we're in this position where we can no longer pretend that it's like 1999. We can't act like that anymore. So we can't pretend that we're all one happy world family and that you don't need to bother with anything as cringe and old fashioned as like a nation and a national identity. Those days are gone now. And we have to get back to basics. And that's kind of what Trump represents, I would say. And I mean, this is happening everywhere. This is happening even in countries like Japan. This is happening all over the world. And Canada is a little bit slow on the uptake, but I think it's going to happen here too.
Let's move on to markets. Gold, again, still chopping around. The markets are closed in the U.S. today, so little activity likely. Gold is actually up a little higher than that right now. I think it's 2709 or something. And then Bitcoin went as high as 108,000 or something like that. I don't have the chart here for some reason. It was 104. I think it went as high as 108 or something like that too. But the big one for sure is Canadian dollar responding to the tariffs being delayed at the least. Saying there's not going to be tariffs today, so the dollar did jump this morning. You can see that little spike there in the bottom right corner there. So again, like I said, if we get a change in government and a mandate that allows us to tap our natural resources, you're going to see a strong rebound in the Canadian dollar. If all of a sudden we say that we're going to tap that wealth for ourselves and for Canadians, that dollar is going to respond very, very well, and that'll be to the betterment of most Canadian consumers.
Yeah, well, the fundamentals cannot be denied. Canada's a huge country. It's got lots of natural resources, lots of farmland, the best educated population in the world by some measures. Hydropower, nuclear power. And also obviously up until today, maybe a good relationship with the United States, the world's largest economy. There is, and also Pacific and Atlantic coastlines and Arctic if the ice is going to melt. I mean, on paper, like Canada's resume is like gold plated, isn't it? It's kind of like unbelievable that this country has so many
We just
things
locked it
going for
all.
it.
We've locked it all up in the garage and said we don't need it though. That's the problem.
Well, almost said like it would be. They're almost embarrassed to use it.
Yeah,
It's like a really fancy sports car, but we don't want to ride it in case people think that we're like showing
yeah.
off or something.
So we're riding around on a scooter while we have a couple Ferraris parked in the garage.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
In the AI world, the big news out of Time Magazine put out AI predictions for 2025, and I agree with this wholeheartedly. That this will be the year of agents, and we're starting to see that with ChatGPT. Even it'll actually do some things. I have it now set up so that every morning it'll round up some of the AI stories for me, EV stories, top 5 stories. So it'll automatically send me the list of stuff that's going on in the world. I don't have to do that myself. And there's different things that people are starting to do with it. But agents, the future of what's going on, and that'll be a big play here in 2025. In the EV world, this is just some of the stuff. Coming to Tesla, some of the lineups. The new Model Y release has happened in China, and they're expecting that to happen very soon here in the United States, and then following that in Canada. They launched FSD in China. Cybertruck's coming with a rear-wheel drive version. Optimus is coming as well in 2025. And then FSD is going to launch in Europe in 2026. But we do have a short chart here showing global EV sales in December. So it is showing global sales rising. That red bar is China. No carbon tax, but look at the growth of EV sales in China. They have tons of EV makers, and over 50% of all the new vehicles sold in China are EVs, and it is the largest automobile market in the world.
I mean, a lot of people might look at that and say, "Oh well, China's got like 1.3, 1.4 billion people, so it's not so surprising." But I mean, China does not account for like 60% of the world's population, whatever that last bar shows. Like they're really punching above even their own substantial weight there.
If you look at their green revolution, they're building larger solar farms than anybody, larger wind farms, and the Australians are worried because they're moving off of coal, and the Australians need to sell their coal somewhere, and they're stressed out about it. So I mean, China has no carbon tax, has not been punished people, and President Xi has said that he will not punish his people with a carbon tax. Instead, he will use technology to advance his people. I mean, obviously it's a communist country, but like they've done a lot there as far as green goes without a punishing compounding carbon tax.
Yeah, well, they are, nominally communist, but they're not Trotskyist types. They're not like world communism, international communism. They're very much about China. So they're like nationalists. That's their ideology. And as we were talking about earlier, they're very much China first, and always basically have been.
And like more of an emperor, I guess you could relate that more to, like, because the person sticks around for a long time. And then another one of the EV startups in the United States has failed, and this one is just. I posted this on LinkedIn. Anybody wants to see more? Canoo has filed for bankruptcy. This thing traded over $9,000 at one time, and it's a SPAC stock. It's just and $1.35 closed on Friday, and it declared bankruptcy on Saturday. And this thing was billed as the Tesla killer and all that stuff, and it was just, there's so much negative press out there on Elon. It tends to just want to go after him, and they use all kinds of different things. This thing was never a contender to upset Tesla. I've watched quite a few things, and it was kind of like the reminiscence of the Volkswagen van. I can't remember what they call that. The bug in the van is called something, and it has a kind of a cult following. But if you look at this van, it's very kind of similar. I watched quite a few videos on it. Was never interested in investing in this one though, but it is filed for bankruptcy protection.
It's a shame in a way, though, isn't it? I mean, it looks like they were trying to do something novel and interesting, but I suppose there are plenty of alternatives in the market still.
Elon has said this over and over again. Easy to build a computer rendering, easy to build a concept car, really hard to put something in production. And that's where Rivian's struggling as well, right? Like their
Yeah.
numbers are still very low, right? There's quite a few Rivians running around town. I'm sure you see in Ottawa too. They're expensive. They just can't get the economies of scale yet. I mean, they may get there. Volkswagen has invested in them, but Volkswagen having its own troubles. I don't know where it's going to get the rest of the money that put up for their investment in Rivian, because they've only put some of that money forward so far in that, I think, $4+ billion that they promised Rivian.
And timing is everything, isn't it? I mean, you kind of have to go to China, don't you, because of the how dominant they are in industrial production. But it's a bit of a dodgy time to go there now with these sort of China's economy is slowing anyway. Its demographics look increasingly bad, and they don't have as many workers as they used to have. And then you also have the kind of US, EU, China trade wars brewing. So it's kind of an unfortunate time. And I feel like America, which will become a manufacturing powerhouse again, that hasn't quite happened yet, has it? They're in that transitional phase before they actually arrive there. So it's a hard time to be trying to mass produce cars, I think.
27 new models, EV models, going to get to Australian shores this year. I mean, they don't have the tariffs on them yet. So that's the thing. Like they are tapping a lot of the world markets where the legacy automakers used to have all of that to themselves, and Europe really reeling in that. They have some of the best automakers, or had some of the best automakers in the world there, Mercedes and BMW and Ferrari and Porsche and Volkswagen, and they're really seeing huge setbacks. And the same thing goes for the Japanese automakers, where Nissan was just recently forced to merge with Honda because it was basically going under.
Yeah, that's a big one, isn't it? That's quite a big sort of domino to fall.
Yeah, the Japanese, that's a big part of their GDP as well as auto manufacturing, right? If we look at the world strengths, again, Canada auto manufacturing 1.7%, not our big strength. Our big strength, again, natural resources, and a government that suppresses our natural resources. We talked about that. But ours is not manufacturing. Ours is not technology. That's the United States. They lead the world in technology. But natural resources, and that's everything from agriculture to oil and gas to mining to forestry. That's our strength. We need a government and a mandate and a leader that can promote that to the benefit of Canadians, so we can have more prosperity for Canadians. Tough to argue that.
Yeah. Well, I think another strength that we haven't mentioned before that Canada has is its finance sector. Like in Toronto, that is actually quite strong if you look at it in comparison to the rest of the world, and yet it stands to benefit enormously. Like those two industries, natural resources and finance, are sort of like mutually beneficial. They strengthen one another. So if one is being held back, then the other one, by extension, will also be held back. So
yeah, as evidenced by if you look at the TSX, which is the Toronto Stock Exchange, that's our basically our trading platform, our financial platform in Canada. It's dominated by our resource sector.
Yeah.
And there you go.
And that's where, obviously, as well, that's where the capital comes from. If you want to open up a project in the Northwest Territories or something like that to mine some precious resource, probably going to go there first to ask for money, aren't you? So, and if the financial boys have been under the impression that natural resources are being suppressed or whatever the claim is, then they're not going to lend money. So it's they kind of sink together a bit.
Well, we may do another segment today just to catch up on what happens with the United States today and see what comes out of all those executive orders and how much of that affects Canada right out of the gate. But right now I'm going to let you go so that you can go and see where that is, because I'm sure he's made a speech by now, and maybe he might be signing some of those orders so we can get kind of an idea of what effect, if any, that'll have on Canada on day one.
Yeah, well, I'm just looking now, and he has finished his speech. He just got a hug from the velvet jacket wearing singer, and I think he is now going to go on to sign the orders. So now he's down to business right away.
Did you watch the rally last night too? And they ended with the YMCA. That was a big boost for that old song, right?
While Trump stood on the stage, didn't he? And kind of he was like part of the act.
And
The
I
village
like
people
how
being like Trumpies is quite a surprising thing, isn't it?
I like how he introduced them. You know, the same group from the past, but maybe not as thin as they were in the past.
No, I mean they're having their like second wind, aren't they? They're getting their last their last hurrah.
They're loving it for sure. I mean, it is. You know, a lot of people are screaming that like the type of song it is and stuff like that. But it definitely has a catchy beat, and I'm sure they're doing very well with it.
But it's also something that Trump can pull off. Like he can simultaneously be this like alpha male figure, this patriarch, but also like a bit camp and a bit silly. I don't know how he does that, but he figures out that combination because it doesn't seem to affect his like his masculinity or whatever, his prestige when he's like sat like his trademark song now is basically one of the most famous gay songs ever. But there you go, he does it.
And a lot of people close to him say that he has a sense of humor, and you could say the same thing about Elon Musk. Maybe that's why they get along, because Elon Musk has a very sarcastic sense of humor as well, and he loves to make himself laugh.
Yeah.
Anyway, we do thank you for watching Kelowna Now, and maybe we'll see you a little later in today. And we do have Renee Merrifield on tomorrow morning, and I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about the election and the Canadian response to it. Thank you for watching Kelowna Now.
We don't just report the news. We live here too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us.